All right, we've got our friend Sohrab Ahmari with us now. He's an author and a columnist. He's the founder of Compact, and he's got a new book out, Tyranny Incorporated. Sohrab, thanks for being with us.
Thanks, Buck, and sorry I missed Clay.
Oh, yeah, no, he sends you his regards. He's, I believe, in the air as we speak. Otherwise, he would certainly be here too. I think this is really interesting, Sohrab, because one of the things about Trumpism that I would say is an observation more than an opinion is it created a broader discussion about economic populism in the country than we'd seen in a long time, what that really means, what that looks like. What is it that corporations are doing from your vantage point that you deal with in this book that you think needs to be addressed, restructured? What are the concerns?
Yeah. So over the past two generations, we've had a shift to ever greater corporate power, Buck, and it's been made possible by the incorrect idea, too often endorsed by kind of the establishment GOP, above all, figures like Paul Ryan or Mitt Romney, that coercion is only what government does to us, and that we don't face coercion in the private economy, in our lives as workers, as consumers, as citizens. And this is actually an alien idea in the Republican, and I mean that in the both the capital R and the small r sense of Republican. In that tradition, our founding fathers were highly alert to the possibilities of private coercion, writing about it in terms of faction, of the dangers of faction in the Federalist Papers, as you know. Over the past, I'd say maybe half a decade or so, we've seen ordinary Republicans, people of the right, become a little bit more skeptical of a kind of free market Uber alles mentality when we see, corporations acting against the common good of the country by, shipping jobs overseas and destroying, wide swaths of manufacturing in the heartland. It's this horrific tragedy where if you look at the maps of the counties that are exposed to, free trade from China, it overlaps almost uncannily with the same areas that are hit by the opioid crisis and so on. And just very briefly, we've also seen in the vaccine mandates, for example, the way that government can often collude with corporations to create laws that impose mandates on ordinary people, which they have to fulfill, and it benefits, obviously big pharma. Or when I was at the New York Post, I've left now, but at the time I was sort of in the eye of the storm having to do with the big tech censorship of the Hunter Biden story, again, partly government related, but also it's just the enormous amount of power wielded by a few Silicon Valley oligarchs and their managers and programmers to silence and unperson the rest of us, including the newspaper founded by Alexander Hamilton. So there's this new alertness to the possibilities of market-based coercion on the right, which I think is healthy and in line with actually older and deeper traditions of the right.
Sohrab, when we talk about this, understanding or awareness of the problem is critical. I feel like where this gets really challenging right away is the things to do about it. You've had the right, I think, in the last year feel a little more of its muscle on these issues of dealing with corporate America than we've seen in a long time. There's the Ron DeSantis approach to Disney in Florida. There's effectively the brand destruction of Bud Light. There have been a number of other things, whether it's a movie that bombed or, is it boycotts that you think are going to change the trajectory or change the tyrannical abilities of corporations? Like, what is, you've diagnosed the disease, if not the cure, what is the treatment for corporate tyranny?
Well, I think boycotts are actually important. I would not sort of poo-poo boycotts. That's one of the weapons of relatively powerless consumers as against much larger entities, and there's a long history of them working in multiple causes. That said, I'm a little bit worried that some of the responses always go toward just sort of at the level of the superficial cultural issues. Not that those aren't important. I don't want Disney, propagandizing my kids into gender ideology more than anyone else. But there are policy solutions, then I sometimes feel, this new crop of more populist type GOP lawmakers, bless their hearts, they'll go on Fox News or they'll go on, on the congressional hearings and they'll berate CEOs and stuff. But they don't, for example, the issue of debanking or depersoning of individuals led by big tech companies. There are policy solutions that they could do, which would actually be, again, deeply in tune with our traditions, which they don't pursue. So, for example, the idea of a common carrier provider is a very powerful one. It actually goes back to the common law in England. So it's very, very old. The idea is that for services that are common to everyone that we all have to use, the provider, even if it's a private provider, can't unreasonably discriminate against individuals. So, for example, we already apply this to trains or to your phone company. Your phone company can't dephone you for saying the wrong thing. And as Justice Clarence Thomas, that famous radical leftist, has suggested, that same common carrier doctrine may have to be applied to things like banks and social media companies, because otherwise, especially right now, it's a lot of conservatives that are on the sharp end of this stuff. Nigel Farage in Britain lost his bank account infamously. January 6 defendants haven't been able to use PayPal to fundraise for their cause, etc. But I think there should be a warning here even to people on the left if they're willing to listen. Right now they're using these mechanisms to basically beat up their enemies. But it doesn't mean that they, potentially won't find themselves on the wrong side of this later. So, again, we have policy mechanisms, traditions in the American and common law that we have to use, and not just sort of shout about it on Fox News. Although, believe me, I've done my share of shouting too.
The book is Tyranny, Inc., How Private Power Crushed American Liberty and What to Do About It. Just one more for you on that, Sohrab. What do we do about big tech and social media companies? It got a lot of attention at the end of the Trump administration. Then Trump didn't end up being president for the next 4 years. Now we see the extent of perhaps the collusion between government entities and big tech for obvious political purposes and really political leverage. So what do we do? How do we handle this? They've seen some conservative, or I shouldn't even say conservative, free speech platforms like Rumble, for example, which is a sponsor here on the show, among others, are out there. What's the way forward?
Yeah, so those free speech platforms are great. I watch Rumble shows myself. But again, there's policy solutions. One is there's a litigation solution, which actually Senator Cruz was the first to propose, which is once it becomes government actively directing social media companies to censor something, then that implicates the First Amendment. Yes, Twitter or Facebook or whatever might be privately owned, but when it's that clearly been sort of subordinated by the government imperative, then you can't say that your First Amendment hasn't been violated. Another one is this common carrier doctrine. That's Clarence Thomas's. No, all these are coming from conservative thinkers and politicians. Common carrier doctrine, the same thing that prevents a publicly owned, a public service oriented private company like your phone company from discriminating against you, should also be applied to big tech. The last one, which gets a bit technical, but it's to reform what's called Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. It's a law that allows, it was enacted before there was Facebook or Twitter or Instagram, but it allows these companies to act like publishers, meaning they can censor stuff, but without facing any of the traditional liabilities of a publisher. Like if I, God forbid, libel someone on this show, not just me, but iHeartRadio would be liable to libel. But for these companies, we've created this mechanism where they can intervene in speech. And the goal was to prevent pornography, hence why the name of the act is the Communications Decency Act. But they're using it. There's plenty of porn on the platforms. They're using it to silence speech. And so if they're going to do that, we have to take away that protection. And I think it will scare them a lot. So these are the policy solutions, I think.
Sohrab Ahmari is the author. The book, Tyranny, Inc., How Private Power Crushed American Liberty and What to Do About It. It is out today. Sohrab, thanks so much.